Wonderful. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us. And good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm so glad you could all join us for this conversation about chasing hope in difficult times. At a moment when the world can feel very heavy, whether it's from conflict, inequality, or the growing pressure on so many of the communities that we care about, coming together to reflect on hope right now seems both urgent and really necessary. It's my great honor to welcome our guest today, Nick Kristof. I know he needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. Nick is a two-time Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and a longtime New York Times columnist whose reporting has taken him to some of the most challenging corners of the world. His most recent book, Chasing Hope, is really a powerful reflection on how compassion, courage, and ordinary people can drive extraordinary change. For decades, he's used his platform to shine a light on injustice, amplify the voices of people, especially women, whose courage too often goes unseen, and to remind us that progress is not only possible, but that it's really happening all around us. Here at Trickle Up, we share that belief in the power of human potential. Every day we see women overcoming extraordinary barriers, which, when just given the chance, the tools, and a little bit of support. Nick's work aligns deeply with our mission, and his stories continually challenge us to look beyond the headlines to the resilience, the ingenuity, and the dignity of the people living in poverty. We're so grateful to have him have him with us today and help us explore what it means to pursue hope with purpose and what each of us can do to make that hope real. Nick, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. No, I'm delighted to be with you. I felt a little bit like Tom Sawyer listening to his funeral with these very nice words. But anyway, I mean, one of the things that gives me hope is the work of Trickle Up and other organizations that, really are using evidence-based ways to try to make this a better world. So thank you for that.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that. Maybe we could just start by you telling us a little bit about what drew you to cover some of these issues and places. You're kind of consistently in some of the most overlooked and dire places in the world. Why?
So, I think it's a couple of things. And I had never really psychoanalyzed myself about this until I was writing Chasing Hope, and and I think I think I realized probably the extent to which my dad's experience had shaped me. His family was Armenian, living in Eastern Europe. They had spied on the Nazis during World War II. They got caught. They fled in every which direction. Some executed by the Nazis, others executed by the Soviets, and then a French diplomat intervened to help save my dad's life at one point. And then a family in Oregon sponsored his way to the U.S. in 1952. And I think, that inevitably evoked a certain empathy for people caught up in very difficult circumstances and a reminder that you don't need to solve a problem in its entirety to make a profound difference. The family that sponsored my dad or that French diplomat, they did not solve the problem of refugees, but it's pretty transformative for the Kristofs. And likewise, I think any of us, we're not going to solve the problem of global poverty. Can we dramatically improve the prospects of some people? Absolutely. And then I think the focus on women was the result of two things. Partly at a kind of macro level, I spent a lot of my career as a reporter in Asia, and I was fascinated by trying to understand why it was that East Asia had enjoyed this economic miracle, even though the countries within it had very different economic strategies. And I came to think that one of the real factors was that these countries, while their economic models were different, they had really invested in human capital, and particularly of women and girls. And that enabled these educated women in turn to then participate in the economy in ways that enormously benefited their own children, for example, that empowered not only them, but the whole society. And, that was sort of the macro level. And at the micro level, it was just seeing really terrible things happen sometimes to women and girls and, around the world, and whether that was them being pulled out of school or being, married at 12 or 13, sometimes as a second or third wife to somebody, or trafficking in some cases, in situations that, just felt to me like 19th century slavery, except these girls were all going to be dead of AIDS by their early 20s. And so that, that was another push to kind of keep trying to focus on these issues. And so here I am.
Yeah, no, really interesting. And I think one of the things when the more you travel and do this work is that you realize that these are just everyday people caught up in events beyond their control, whether that be conflict or whether that just be living in a community that's faced with dire poverty. And you talk about child marriage, and I've talked with so many families and households that have engaged in that, and often households see it as a way to save their daughters. We have too many children, we can't feed them all if we marry this daughter. So people are making terrible choices um, based on their limited options. And
That's right. That's right. And there are no silver bullets, but I'm a farm boy, so to excuse a rural metaphor, I do believe in silver buckshot, and that
I
one of
like
those
that. I'm gonna steal that one.
steal away. One of those buckshot is empowering women and giving them some financial opportunities. And it's imperfect, but it helps. And educating girls is again a one element of that. And there are many other elements as well. But I think sometimes we're paralyzed by a sense that these problems are vast, that the problems are perennial, and we can't really do much about them. And I don't think that's quite right. I think that, in fact, we've made a lot of progress and can continue to do so if we just put our shoulder to the wheel.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we all see is that when women control resources in their household, one of the first things they invest in is educating their children and their daughters, because they know the impact that can have in the long term.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, and there's so many effects of education. One of the bits of pushback that I often get from people is that, if you try to fight poverty, or you try to reduce child mortality, then people will just have more babies and we'll end up in this Malthusian cycle. And I mean, that's kind of wrong on its face that when people know that their children will survive, that they have fewer children. But it's also true that um, reducing fertility in societies is not just about providing condoms or other forms of birth control. One of the most powerful things one can do is actually educate girls. And educated women have dramatically fewer children. Educated men have modestly fewer, but one of the best ways to help countries reduce population growth is indeed to educate girls,
Educate
and
girls.
that gives them many more options and makes them more aware about options to reduce their own fertility if they want to do so.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In your memoir, you write about kind of you covered so many global events, sometimes in the middle of real political chaos. We in the development sector felt a little bit of that political chaos this year with the cutting of USAID and the real devastations of the development sector because of that. Um, as an opinion columnist, you really used your platform in the last couple of months to really point out what the impact of some of that has been. How do you, as a journalist, use your kind of journalism as a tool to both educate but also inspire people to action?
So I've been a longtime foreign correspondent, and then I became a columnist in the aftermath of 9/11. Essentially, the Times thought that they could use another columnist writing about global affairs. And when I got that job, I was under the misimpression that, boy, I'm going to be changing people's minds twice a week, and I'm going to, write my columns, and boy, they're going to see the light. And I quickly realized it doesn't work like that at all, and that if I write about issues that people have already thought about, then, if I write about gun control, about abortion, for the most part about President Trump, whatever, then the people who start out agreeing with me think, oh, what a great column. And the people who start out
You
disagreeing
think
with
that all
me
the
think,
time?
Kristof completely missed the boat again. But where I think that we as columnists, and I think journalists in general, truly can have an impact is not so much in changing people's minds on issues that they have thought about, but rather is shining a spotlight on an issue that is neglected and thereby projecting it onto the agenda and making people think about it. Essentially, it's the gatekeeper function in helping make people think about sometimes disturbing issues, making them spill their coffee in the morning. And I think that the aid cuts are an example of that. My the first big piece I did about aid cuts from South Sudan, uh, I heard later that President Trump and Elon Musk were talking about it in the Oval Office, and I listed a bunch of children who had died because of their cuts, and that they were surprised by that, and that Musk was saying, "Oh, I didn't think kids were going to be dying," and I think that if we can show the actual consequences and put human faces on some of these issues, and ideally do it without wagging too many fingers, then sometimes we can win people over to our side and ameliorate the consequences of really terrible decisions. And the progress is very imperfect, but here and there you can make some progress.
Well, that's the perfect theme for your book, which is hope. Um, let's talk about that a minute. How did you choose that as a theme for your memoir? And how have you maintained hope when truly you've seen some of the you know, worst things humanity can do to itself and to each other in your reporting?
Lauren, it's kind of funny when people first meet me, if they're familiar with my columns, then I meet them at a cocktail party or something, and they look at me sort of nervously, and I think they're afraid I'm gonna, pin them in a corner and tell them about, terrible recent developments in Ethiopia or Haiti or something. And and they think that I'm going to be this dour, grim, pessimist, this kind of Eeyore of journalists. And the truth is that I've had a career covering really terrible things, and they have left a mark on me. But I think there are two ways in which what I've covered have actually left me with a certain sense of hope, if you will. And one is that um, I think we all have a very human bias toward self-selection, toward kind of bad news and things that are going wrong. And, in journalism, we cover planes that crash, not planes that are landing. Um, and we sort of make allowance for that in the case of aviation. But if we're writing about the global south, then people don't really have a framework to understand it, and they think that all planes are crashing. And so people in polls, they think that about almost 90% of people think that global poverty is getting worse or has remained the same. And, over the last 25 years, one of the most important things happening in modern history has been this incredible progress against global poverty, these incredible reductions in child mortality. Um, Maybe the worst thing that can happen to a person is to lose a child. And in when I was a baby, 1/5 of all babies worldwide died before the age of 5. Now we're down to about 3%, and it's way too many, and we can do way better than that. But that is real progress. And, in your area, the Trickle Ups area of extreme poverty. When I graduated from college, 41% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. Now we're down to below 10%. Um, and, so that is part of it that I have seen in my career, a real arc of painstaking, intermittent, imperfect progress. And I think the other thing is that in covering these sometimes terrible things that are happening, what you discover is that side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best. And you find warlords committing terrible, terrible atrocities, doing terrible things. You see people starving, but you also just see the courage, the decency, of so many people working to try to mitigate those disasters, and that have left a real mark on me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things I think your analogy about the plane crashes is a good one, because I think sometimes when we talk about these distant places, it can feel very much like these are other people, different people from us. Maybe people who are used to living in poverty, who are used to their circumstances. But the truth is, there's no mother who puts a hungry child to bed and it doesn't hurt her heart. There's no father who can't buy the medicine his children need and doesn't feel um, that impact his self identity. There everyone is at base a person, and I think one of the beautiful things about what you do in your writing is that you help people to see that we all live in different circumstances. At the heart, we're all people striving to make life better for ourselves and for our children. And the more we can make that connection of kind of humanness between all of us, the easier it is, I think, for us, for people in the U.S. and the West who are luckier to have more empathy for people who grow up in different circumstances.
Yeah, I think it's kind of inevitable that we tend to otherize people based on all kinds of things, on race, on faith, on you know, nationality. But one of the things you do learn in traveling is that our commonalities vastly exceed our differences. And one of my one of my epiphanies came early in the Darfur crisis, and I was covering the Darfur genocide, and it was so frustrating because I felt that I was just so disturbed by what I was seeing, and I was writing these things, and it just felt like it was disappearing without a ripple. And meanwhile, at the same time in New York City, I'm sure some folks watching may remember this. There were these two hawks that were living in an apartment building right next to Central Park, and the building didn't like their bird droppings from their nest, and so the building dismantled their nest, and all New York was suddenly up in arms about these two poor homeless hawks. And I thought, clearly New Yorkers have great empathy, but how is it they can feel such empathy for these two homeless hawks, but not for hundreds of thousands of people who are being killed in Darfur? And that led me to the work in social psychology about what makes us care. And it turns out to be largely about two things. One is about individual stories, not about populations in distress. And the other is about some indication that if we do get engaged, that if we care, that there can be a better outcome. And I think that in both the nonprofit world and in journalism, we often violate both rules. We talk about 6 million people starving in West Africa or whatever. And we so focus on all the needs for very understandable reasons that we don't adequately acknowledge a backdrop of progress or some possibility to really make a big difference. And so ever since then, I've tried to tell, to at least start a column with an individual story as a way of building a little bit of that empathy, of that compassion, and then generalizing it to the larger problem. And also acknowledging that while the problems are acute and terrible, that there are real ways of turning things around. And that was the strategy my wife and I used in Over Half the Sky. That was what I used in Chasing Hope. And it's an uphill struggle, but sometimes it does get through.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's almost a psychological protection too. Like if we all had to think about how much human suffering was going on in the world at all the time, it would be, so oppressive and difficult. And so psychologically, it's easier to other it a little bit. But I do think one of the things that helps is finding the hope in it, finding the solutions in it, feeling like there's something I can do that can make that slightly better or can help ameliorate that situation.
That's true.
What
And
are
I, And I also
Go
just
ahead,
wish
Nicholas.
that we would give politicians more credit when they do the right thing. Again, journalists like me are partly at fault. Um, in 2003, President George W. Bush approved PEPFAR, his really
One of
revolutionary
the most
program.
amazing initiatives. It saved more lives than, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And it saved 26 million lives so far. It was the best program of government program in my adult life. And I did too much carping about it early in its existence, because I thought that it was too focused on abstinence only, things like that. And I mean those criticisms I think were right, but at the end of the day, it turned the tide on HIV AIDS. It was an extraordinary program, an incredible act of generosity. And I I wish that I had been more generous toward President Bush, and I wish Americans were more aware of what they accomplished in turning the tide of AIDS worldwide.
Yeah, absolutely. I spent most of my career um, living and working in Africa, and it is to Africans, President Bush is their favorite American president. You would think it would be Obama um, for obvious reasons, but no, they really credit Bush with turning the tide and stemming the spread of AIDS and the work that's happened to save lives there. So it really is. I think you make a good point that we sometimes nitpick around the edges and don't see the forest for the trees. And PEPFAR has been, and I think a perfect example of the way when the U.S. really puts its attention to problems, it can turn the tide globally.
Absolutely. Yep.
Where are some things you're seeing that maybe we're not paying attention enough to right now, where positive trends are happening, positive things are happening, and we're so caught up in some of our, nitpicking that we're missing some of these bright spots?
So, in the medication world, there really has been, I think, real progress in a number of fronts. And the Trump administration, for all its dismantling of USAID, it has endorsed an injection to a preventive injection, lenacapavir, against HIV transmission that is incredibly promising, and I hope will help make it widespread. And I think we're also um, seeing, I mean, just some little things. There's what's known as MMS, which stands for what, maternal something supplement. The S is supplement, maternal micronutrient supplements, maybe. They're kind of
Sounds right.
prenatal vitamins plus iron plus folic acid. And I think it's about $2.17 per pregnancy, and dramatically improves fetal outcomes and maternal outcomes. Just so inexpensive. Sierra Leone is now the first country to roll it out universally as part of prenatal care. Um, and actually, I mean, maternal mortality is one area. So when we wrote Half the Sky in 2009, 500,000 women were dying annually through pregnancy and childbirth. Now we're down to just over half that. And, that's an incredible stride forward.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think we're seeing progress every day. I think one of the extraordinary examples is just how many governments in developing countries we're now seeing putting resources towards. Obviously, not all, but I think Ethiopia is a great example where that national government has really made a commitment to supporting the poorest households through social safety net programs, and as a result, we're seeing really significant reductions in household poverty rates there. Now, they had a long way to go. They still have a long way to go, but progress shouldn't be um, negated just because there's still a long road ahead.
Yeah. I think in general, I think there's a sort of a tension between progress in medical and scientific terms so I think we're gaining a much better understanding of how to reduce child mortality, maternal mortality, et cetera. We're also one of the great mysteries for, for centuries had been how to chip away at poverty. And I think that now, partly because of randomized controlled trials and economic experiments, we're getting a better sense of what actually works. Um, but conversely, I worry a lot about growing conflict. And when you do have, wars spreading, it becomes so difficult to it. I mean, that just freezes everything out. And so, um, I think the progress you mentioned in Ethiopia is real. I also worry that there is a risk of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, all becoming caught up in this vast conflagration, and something similar in West Africa with Mali, Niger,
Yeah.
Burkina Faso, Mauritania. Um, and so, but I do think that we can improve the outcomes and make it less likely that those wars grow and persist. I wish we were more energetically trying to
Engaging.
engage, and try to bring about a secure peace in those places.
Yes, I echo that. East Africa is one of my favorite parts of the world, and Ethiopia has been caught up in this recurring cycle of conflict for the past 50 years. And it's difficult to see. And Somalia is one of my favorite places. I've spent quite a bit of time there, and it's difficult to see how little attention is paid to it, and the kind of stagnant situation there, because it's a beautiful, beautiful country. Yeah. But
Absolutely. Yep.
one of the things that Trickle Up and you have in common is a real focus on women and girls. And you've done quite a bit of writing recently about how some of the global aid cuts have really impacted women and girls. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that for us.
Yeah. I mean, I think two things are true that make these impacts particularly problematic. One is that, while President Trump's aid cuts, and of course those were in a sense created a permission structure for Britain and France and Japan and other countries
Germany.
also to cut aid. So instead of other countries filling in the gaps, they're exacerbating the shortage of funding. Um, and so they're not deliberately targeting women and girls, but often the most vulnerable people in these societies are girls, especially rural girls. And so if a family doesn't have enough money to send all their kids to school, very often they will say, well, it's most important that our son go to school. If there isn't an easy way to take your children to the doctor, then I remember as one person explained to me, when your son is sick, you take him to the doctor, and when your daughter is sick, you feel her forehead and say, well, let's see how you are tomorrow. And so it is, girls who disproportionately suffer in these times of great economic stress. And as you mentioned earlier, one coping mechanism, if there isn't enough food to go around, is to marry off your young teenage daughter, in part so she can eat, and in part so the rest of the family can eat. So, one element is that girls are robbed of education, of any chance to flourish in their lives. And the other is that, one of the great things we've learned is that the path forward for these countries, for men as well as women, is to educate girls, to invest in them, to give them opportunities, to allow them to harness their resources, to allow a bird to fly with both wings, if you will. And so the upshot of these cuts, where they do affect um, women and girls disproportionately, is in turn that it disproportionately affects the outcomes of those countries and the opportunities for peace and security in these places.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we see as well when girls are married early is that they're then more likely to give birth early, not surprising, which means both their health and their children's health are negatively impacted. So the consequences of of that last forever. Those children have much poorer outcomes as they grow into adulthood. They're much more likely to be stunted and malnourished, and it just perpetuates a cycle then of um, you know underfed children, of poor households, of needing to marry girls off early. Um, yeah, so
That's absolutely right. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and um, the whole idea of investing in women and girls, it's partly a matter of justice, but it's also a matter of economic impact. And it always used to um, amuse me when I'd be in Afghanistan reporting. And on the one hand, you'd get, the social justice types and the feminists who'd be arguing, it's so important to educate these girls, give them opportunities. And absolutely. But you'd also run into these hard-bitten U.S. generals who, they were just out to try to protect their American troops in that area. And they saw that in a given district, one of the best ways to chip away at the Taliban's influence was to educate girls in that district. And I do frankly think that if we had been more serious about educating girls in Afghanistan beginning in the early 2000s, we might not have ended up in such a mess, in the 2020s.
yeah, absolutely. Um, in your book, Half the Sky, you kind of wrote about a little bit about the disproportionate burden we put on women sometimes to take on all of these responsibilities. Like, oh, you're already doing, we already know women live in time poverty. They do the majority of the housework. They also have economic activities, and now they have to, help their country, um, economically. At the same time, we know that women show remarkable determination when they have opportunities um, to invest in themselves, invest in their children, to develop economic activities. Where do you think, we've talked a little bit about education. What do you think are some of the areas where we see real impact when we invest in women and girls?
So, I mean, there's one area that I know that you were involved in earlier in your career and that Trickle Up is involved in as well, and that is savings programs. So, village savings and loan associations are one element of that. And I think that there was a lot of excitement about 20 years ago about micro lending and micro lending, has real uses. It can definitely help people, but it also, for those people who aren't great entrepreneurs, it can also leave them with debt. It's a little more complicated. Micro savings is, it's kind of self-funding because people are just, they're putting in tiny amounts of money, and it helps just about everybody. Almost everybody is better off if they have savings. And one of the great failures in economic failures in poor countries is that there isn't really a good way to save. And your income is often very lumpy. So you may get it at the end of a harvest. You may get a large sum. And, it's not coming in every every week or every 2 weeks. It's coming in. And you can't, you don't have a bank account. You don't have an ID. You can't just take it to the bank and deposit it. So you can buy, um, you can buy a cow or two, or you can buy a bunch of chickens. In a sense, that is your savings account. But, if your cow dies, then you don't have bank insurance to, repay you. The savings are gone. There are commercial money lenders in West Africa, for example, who will accept deposits, but they charge you interest on your deposits and really high interest rates. And so these micro savings associations, they're a way of helping people save and then lending to usually female entrepreneurs in that community, so that those people can then start businesses and everybody gets a return on that. And one of the things that really has struck me about them is that you know there are a lot of aid programs really dependent on the aid organization, and in both East Africa and Southern Africa, and then also in Nepal, I saw how these savings associations grew organically, kind of by themselves, because if this village had one, then the next village would say, "Wow, look at what's going on over there," and then they would copy it. And I think that's a tribute to a really smart program.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes there's the impression that people are too poor to save, but actually that's not true. They lack the mechanisms to save, but actually poor women are some of the best savers in the world because they don't have any choice, right? And so they often save in multiple ways. They'll sometimes put money with a distant relative, and that's kind of the emergency money that's not readily available. Then they'll put some money in the pot in the kitchen for their regular expenses, but their incomes are inconsistent, and so saving for them is one of the most important strategies. And these savings groups really help them to save in a way that can become productive and save over time, and think about how they're going to use that money productively. And I think people are often shocked when they realize how much money is out in rural communities and being saved by these women at 25 cents and 50 cents a week.
And it's certainly a really important way to help people start businesses, for example. But it's also life-saving in the sense that, if your child is sick and needs to be rushed to a doctor, and if you don't have any savings, that child may well die. If you do have access to some savings, then you have the resources to you know, hire a little motorcycle taxi, get that child to a doctor, or and hopefully save the child's life.
And
So it's transformative.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And oftentimes, as you mentioned, that's kind of my background is with savings groups. That's where I started. Often women will say, "This is the first time I held, the equivalent of $5 in my hand, and I got to make the decision about how we spent it." And sometimes it's not huge amounts of money, but women often don't have control of that money, and for them to be able to save it up over time and then decide how to spend it, and it doesn't take a lot of money to buy a couple of ingredients, bake some things, sell them, make a little bit more money, and really start them on a path towards entrepreneurship and towards earning their own income that
Yeah,
they can
absolutely.
control. Yeah.
And once a woman is earning money, I mean, often women have been kind of frozen out of the commercial economy, and so like in many countries, farm families will grow crops to eat and also some crops to sell. And the structure is such that the crops that the family grows for themselves are called the women's crops, and the crops that are sold for cash become the men's crops.
Yeah.
And
It's amazing how
so
that works.
yeah, so you know, so the women sometimes women haven't even held money, and but through the savings they do earn money. They then start these businesses, and trickle up is obviously that's a major strategy to trickle up. And then once they get money, then it changes the dynamic in the family, and all of a sudden, women become partners of their husband. It becomes less likely the husband is going to beat the wife. It becomes less likely that he is going to make all decisions about the kids, and so on. It really does transform that dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'm going to bring it back to the US a minute. I mean, we just kind of had a great conversation about, a program that we really think is transformative in women's lives. But we're at a time in the US where a lot of people are very kind of inwardly focused on what's happening in the US right now, and for good reason sometimes. But how do you think we can start to, and certainly with the shutdown of USAID, I think we got a real sense that for the everyday American, they're sort of disengaged from America's role in the fight against poverty globally. How do we? I know you're trying through your work. How can we trickle up help kind of raise the issue and make it more urgent and salient to the US public?
So, um, I think that in the US, we often hear arguments along the lines of that, we need to solve the problems in our own backyard first. That Tom DeLay, I remember once called 480, called it putting Ghana over grandma. And I think that, people do often think in those terms. And I think it's a mistake to pit them against each other. And it is true that we have real needs at home. There are also real needs abroad. We were a lot poorer in the 1930s, yet it would have been a mistake to, you know, or in the late 30s, early 40s to, ignore the Holocaust and say, oh, we got to solve the problems in our own backyard. Um, and, as I think about the trade-offs, uh, I think that uh, at one level, I mean, one consideration is that it's a lot less expensive to save a life or transform a life abroad than it is at home. Um, and so money goes a lot farther in other countries. It's often also, I think, a little bit easier to understand how to address some global needs than it is some needs at home. Um, and I don't think that our compassion should depend on a person's skin color or passport color. Um, you know, that said, we truly do have needs at home. And I think sometimes among young people in particular, it becomes kind of cool to go off and, show concern for people halfway around the world, but not people on the wrong side of the tracks in one's own city. And I think that's likewise misguided. We do have the bandwidth to care about people at home and abroad and to try to make imperfect efforts at both levels.
I love that. And I think it's very true, very true. I'm going to ask you one last question and then I'm going to open it up to the group. Um, there's a writer and an organizer here in the US, Mariama Kabe, and she has a saying that I love, which my daughter introduced to me called Hope is a Discipline. It's not wishful thinking, but it's but the practice of imagining better and choosing to show up again and again to move the world forward. In your own reporting and in Chasing Hope, how do you think about hope as a discipline? And what advice would you give to all of us working in communities facing deep inequality, deep poverty, about cultivating that kind of discipline and disciplined hope in our daily work?
Yeah, I mean, my line, which I think is a little parallel to hope as a discipline, is that hope is a muscle.
Yep.
And, but I think it's the same idea. And yeah, I think there's a misperception sometimes that hope is this naive emotion, this sort of confidence, Panglossian confidence that somehow everything's going to work out just fine. And I don't think of it as that. I think of it as more in the sense that if we put our shoulder to the wheel, we have a chance of having better outcomes. And it may not work, but we have a shot. And in fact, I see it's the opposite, that a kind of despair is paralyzing, and that hope is empowering because it gives us some chance of getting out of this trap in which we find ourselves. Um, and I've seen that over and over that people, even in, extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I mean, and it's been true with me. I start chasing hope in with my plane about to crash in Congo and contemplating my grave there, and it looked pretty grim. And obviously, I don't want to give too much away, but I did survive that plane crash. And
I think I've been on that same plane in Congo.
um, and so I think that that hope, we should think of hope as something that can remind us that we should be working to try to improve outcomes and that it's not a sure thing, but that we've gotten out of really, really difficult, terrible situations in the past. And if we work with others, we can improve our odds this time as well.
Perfect. That's great. We have a couple questions from our audience, so I'm gonna dig into those. And this first one actually is a kind of a great segue from that. So, what are some of the ways you've experienced joy through your work and travels? What have you seen that has brought you heartfelt happiness? That's a great question.
So I think, a lot of it is just some of the individual stories that are just, triumphant when you don't expect them. I, um, there was I spoke earlier about how side by side with the worst of humanity, you find the very best. One of the best examples of that to me was a woman I met in rural Pakistan called Mukhtar Mai. And Mukhtar had been uh, sentenced by her village council to be gang raped because of something that her younger brother supposedly had done. And in fact, I don't think her brother had done it, but in any case, the village council, they sentenced her to that, and then they carried out that sentence, and they gang raped her. I think their expectation was that she would then kill herself out of shame. And but instead, Mukhtar found it within herself to report the crime to the police, to prosecute her attackers, to send them to prison. And then she used compensation money for that rape to start the first school in her village because she believed that education was the best way to chip away at the cruelty and misogyny that she had suffered. And then she enrolled the children of her attackers in her school. And I mean, I visited that school a number of times over the years, and being in that little village and being in that school and seeing these kids in their school uniforms, including the children of those attackers, studying English and Urdu and math, that gave me joy. And it underscored that while we humans are capable of terrible, grievous things, we're also capable of extraordinary magnanimity and courage and resilience and strength.
And grace, yeah, that's a wonderful story. Yeah, and it's a reminder we've often, you talk about your plane in Congo. I worked there as well, and sometimes you go to communities and every person in that community is a trauma victim. That some of those
Yes,
communities have been overrun by armies, multiple times, and what happens to them when that happens is horrific. But yet, people are going about their life and finding joy in their lives. And if they can do it, certainly we can. Um, Most of us have been through
absolutely.
much less terrible things.
What gives you joy? Let me turn the tables.
I will say I'm an infamous when we're out in the field child taker. So if someone comes to a meeting with their child, I'm inevitably going to end up holding it. So to the children give me hope and joy all the time. They come at all of this with such innocence and wonder and expectation and laughter and joy. And again, if they can have it, I certainly can have it for them. So yeah, the children
Absolutely.
always do it for me. Next question in the queue. For so long, we've relied on big donors and big government programs to provide sustained support to address these huge challenges. In some cases, perhaps too much hope in donors solving seemingly intractable challenges. What examples of new approaches to funding and partnerships do you see beginning to take shape that perhaps provide sustainable support?
So there's something of a debate right now about whether the US aid cuts will, I think there is some agreement that there is a overdependence in the global South on programs, created in Washington and London, et cetera, and that too many of these, resources are being parceled out in conference rooms in Washington where people don't fully understand the issues. Um, and and so there are some folks in Africa in particular who say this is an opportunity to actually rethink the aid structure and have local countries put more money into healthcare, et cetera. And, um, you know, I mean, there is some logic to that. I think that that would be it may force that to some degree. I mean, I just worry that in the meantime, there are going to be a lot of kids dying. And the Gates Foundation just said their estimate is an extra 200,000 kids will die per year because of these cuts. And I don't think that's a price worth paying for building structures with less dependence on Western resources. But there are, in Sudan, for example, probably the world's worst humanitarian crisis right now.
I'm amazed
Um,
you can find a silver lining in Sudan, but I'm looking
yeah.
forward to it.
Well, the U.S. cut off funding there for aid programs, but their programs called emergency response rooms, which are like sort of local community kitchens, volunteer-led by local communities that are an impressive local response. And they're imperfect and they don't have enough money. Vast numbers of people will die. Already 400,000 people or so have died in Sudan. But this is an interesting grassroots, bottom-up model in a crisis that is mitigating the mortality there.
Yeah. I often say that there's probably none of us who would have argued with the contention that the aid architecture needed reform, but there were surely a lot less cruel ways to have gone about it.
Yep,
Um, yeah,
exactly right.
and I think that stat you put out, that the Gates Foundation put out, kind of gets to your early point. 200,000 children is a lot of children, but actually, if you look at one child, your child, a child you see on the street, and think, no, that's a child that could have been lost by this, and then there is, you think that there is a family out there that has lost a child. Well, how would I feel if I lost a child in a way that was entirely preventable?
That's
It
exactly
really
right.
brings home, yeah, how horrific this situation has been, and how honestly unconscionable it's been. Um, but on that note, um, uh, last question. Have you noticed a shift in your subject selection or approach and/or subject choices among your colleagues in this difficult and divisive political climate?
So, I mean, in general, since 2016, I've written more about the US. And in general, I think, coverage in the New York Times and other publications has been more domestic. And, I can't speak for everybody else, but I do think that's partly because the most transformative decisions these days, in many ways, are being made in Washington. And, I mean, those 200,000 extra kids who are dying annually, those are because of decisions made in Washington by the likes of President Trump and Elon Musk. And so I do think that in some ways, these domestic happenings are of particular global resonance right now. Um, I fear that the U.S. population is retreating, and we are providing less coverage to some of these international issues, even though they deserve a lot more. And I also think that when there isn't coverage, and maybe especially TV coverage, then these problems become invisible and there's no accountability. I worry that we have created a system right now where if you're a dictator who covets your neighbor's land, this is actually kind of an ideal moment to go in with guns blazing, and that the penalty for committing wartime atrocities is less than it has often been. Um, so I think that's, we saw that. I think that's what we're seeing in Sudan right now. The United Arab Emirates is funding a militia, the RSF, that is committing, mass murder, mass rape. Um, Azerbaijan went into a disputed area that had been controlled by Armenia. Rwanda moved into Congo, et cetera, et cetera. And these things haven't really been much covered in ways that created disincentive. Um, there was Gaza did get coverage. One can argue about how good the coverage was, but it certainly was in the headlines, and Ukraine got coverage likewise. But other global crises have pretty much been ignored. Um, it's true of Sudan. There was a horrific crisis in the Tigray region of Ethiopia, cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and again, just got, the amount of column inches per 100,000 people killed was, I think should shame journalism.
Yeah,
And I worry that if we don't cover these crises, then they just fester and continue and grow.
yeah, yeah. And I think your point earlier, which is that um, there's real suffering in the U.S. as well. Obviously, we just went through a massive food crisis in the U.S. One I suspect is not over, and um, we can, but we are all adults. We can keep in both hands the fact that there are needs in the U.S. that are real and significant, and there are crises and needs and globally that are every bit as real and significant,
Yeah.
and often every bit as man-made.
Yeah, a chunk of Chasing Hope, as you know, is about my hometown in rural Oregon, because as I was coming back from covering these global crises, I was coming back to my rural hometown and finding a humanitarian crisis there. Basically, good jobs went away, meth arrived, and at this point, a third of the kids on my old school bus are gone from drugs, alcohol, and suicide. And it was, wrenching to see this happening to old friends that I cared deeply about, to see old friends not only suffering greatly, but also inflicting great suffering on others and trying to, and so over the last decade, especially, I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what went wrong at a personal level. My wife and I have tried to. We started our own little small business to try to address this, to try to and to help the local community. Um, and so, I do think we can care about our neighborhood and also care about what's going on half a world away.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Nick, we are about at time. I want to thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I could keep going, but I won't, because I know you need to get some places. Go ahead.
Well, thank you. I mean, I just want to also thank you, Lauren, and thank your colleagues at Trickle Up, and thank those who are, watching for their support of Trickle Up, because it's, as I said, it's one of those organizations that is out there doing the work. I'm kind of in the lighting business. I shine a spotlight on folks, but it's, your team that is out in the field actually doing the work. And so, thanks to you and everybody for supporting it.
Well, thank you so much, and I will use that as a segue. I want to thank everyone for joining us. But as Trickle Up CEO, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that if today's conversation has inspired you, this is a wonderful moment to help us move closer to our goal of reaching 5 million people and impacting their lives by 2030. In the spirit of Giving Tuesday, I hope that many of you will consider making a donation to Trickle Up. Please also consider buying Nick's book as a holiday gift. I am sure that many of you know people that would love it and would appreciate his remarkable stories of resilience and courage. So you'll find links in the chat to both Trickle Up's donation page as well as to a site where you can purchase Nick's book. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, for all of your generosity, and for being such an essential part of Trickle Up's mission. And Nick, if I can ask you to hang on the line for just 1 minute, but I will thank everyone else for joining us.